The morning George Voss was buried, the sky above Minnesota territory was the pale, indifferent blue of a man who has already moved on to other business. No clouds, no wind, just that flat, enormous sky pressing down on the black-dressed people standing around a hole in the earth, and Harriet Voss standing among them, perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her, like she was waiting for a meeting to begin. She was 62 years old. She had lived on this land for 40 years. She had broken its soil with her own hands, carried water from its creek in every season, learned where the frost came early and where it came late, which corner of the north pasture flooded in April, and which barn wall caught the afternoon sun in February, and stayed just warm enough to keep the animals breathing through the worst cold. She knew this land the way you know a person you have shared a bed with for 4 decades. Every mood, every silence, every small betrayal, and every unexpected grace. George had not been a complicated man. He was solid and quiet and fair. The kind of man who paid his debts before he bought himself anything new, who remembered the names of other people's children, who could fix almost anything with the tools he had on hand rather than the tools he wished he had. He had loved Harriet in the way of men who do not say the word often, but demonstrated in 10,000 small acts across a lifetime. When the horse threw him in the south field on a Tuesday in June and he struck the back of his head on the iron edge of the old fence post, he did not die immediately. He lingered for 11 days. Harriet did not leave the farm during those 11 days. She sat beside him and held his hand and talked to him about ordinary things: the garden, the weather, the particular stubbornness of the gray mule they had owned for 15 years. She did not cry in front of him. She had decided that whatever time remained would not be filled with her grief. It would be filled with her presence. He died on a Thursday morning with her hand in his and her voice in the room. She did not cry then either, not in front of anyone. What Harriet Voss felt in the days after the burial was not grief in the way people expected to see it. It was something quieter and more total, like a sound you have lived with so long that you only notice it when it stops. 40 years of a particular kind of presence. Gone. She moved through the farmhouse doing the things that needed doing, and she was aware in a way she could not have explained to another person of the exact shape of his absence in every room. The chair he had pulled out from the table the same way every morning for 4 decades. The hook by the door where his coat had hung in a specific, slightly crooked position because the nail was set a half-inch lower than ideal, and George had never bothered to reset it. The sound the house made in the evening without him in it, a different silence, a silence with a different weight. She did not think about what came next, not yet. She assumed there would be time for that. She was wrong about the time. His name was Garrett. He was 39 years old, and he had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and almost none of his father's character. This was not entirely his fault. Garrett had grown up in the shadow of a man who did everything correctly and efficiently and without complaint, and rather than being inspired by this, Garrett had been quietly exhausted by it and had spent most of his adult life looking for someone who would tell him that ordinary effort was sufficient. He had found that person in Constance. Constance Voss was 35 years old. She was not a cruel woman in the way that word is usually meant. She did not enjoy the suffering of others. She did not take pleasure in small acts of humiliation or feel satisfaction when someone weaker than herself was brought low. What Constance was in the most accurate and bloodless sense of the word was practical. She understood the world as a system of resources and claims, and she navigated that system with the calm efficiency of someone who has studied the rules carefully and intends to follow them precisely because following them precisely is what produces the desired outcome. The desired outcome in this case was the farm, not part of the farm, not a negotiated share of the farm. The farm. She had known about the deed for 3 years. In the early weeks of her marriage to Garrett, when she was still learning the shape of the Voss family's holdings, she had asked to see the land documents. Garrett had shown them to her without suspicion, the way people show things to those they trust completely. And there it was, or rather, there it was not. Harriet Voss's name did not appear on the deed to the property. George had filed the original claim alone before the marriage and had never updated it. In 40 years of working that land, raising her children on it, burying 2 of those children in its soil, Harriet had never thought to ask about the paperwork. Why would she? It was her home. That was a fact as fundamental as the ground itself. Constance saw it differently. Constance saw a legal opening wide enough to drive a wagon through. She waited. She was patient in the way that people are patient when they are completely certain of the outcome. She waited until George was in the ground and the mourners had gone home and the farm was legally, unambiguously in the possession of his son and only heir. Then she waited 3 more weeks because 3 weeks was enough time to seem respectful without being impractical. On a Tuesday morning in August, with the summer heat still sitting heavy on the land and the corn standing tall in the east field, Constance placed the documents on the kitchen table. Garrett sat at the far end of that table and looked at his hands. Harriet looked at the documents. She read them carefully, the way she read everything, without rushing, without the performance of reaction. She understood what they were. She understood what they meant. She understood in the same moment that this had not happened accidentally or impulsively, that the documents were not a question, but an answer to a question that had been asked long before this morning. She looked at her son. Garrett looked at his hands. That was when she knew. Not from Constance, whose face showed nothing more than polite resolution. From Garrett. From the particular quality of his stillness, the way a man sits when he has made a decision he is ashamed of but will not reverse. He would not look at her. Not because he was cold, because he knew exactly what he was participating in and had decided that the farm was worth it. Constance spoke in a reasonable, measured voice. There was no malice in her tone. She explained the legal situation as she understood it. She noted that the farm, as the primary asset of George Voss's estate, passed to his surviving son. She acknowledged Harriet's decades of contribution to the property. She suggested that an arrangement could perhaps be made, a small monthly sum, a gesture of continued connection, provided that Harriet did not contest the transfer of the estate. Harriet listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she asked one question. She asked whether the $40 she had kept in the tin box behind the flour canister, the money she had earned from 3 years of selling her herb remedies to the settlement doctor, was legally considered part of the estate. Constance paused for just a moment. Then she said no, that money was Harriet's own. Harriet nodded once. She stood. She walked to the bedroom she had shared with George for 40 years, and she packed one traveling bag. She took her clothing, her father's field journal, a small knife, in the tin box. She left everything else. The furniture she had chosen, the curtains she had sewn, the garden she had planted by hand 17 consecutive springs, the hook by the door with the nails set a half-inch too low. She came back to the kitchen and picked up the bag. Garrett finally looked up. His mouth opened. She did not stop walking. She went out the front door and down the porch steps and along the road without looking back, and she did not give Constance the satisfaction of watching her face when she left. What Harriet understood walking down that road with $40 in a tin box and one bag over her shoulder was something she had not fully articulated even to herself until that moment. Constance had not moved against her out of hatred. Constance had moved against her out of calculation, and the calculation was specific. It was based on knowledge of Harriet's character. Constance had understood that there was one piece of information that could have changed everything. One legal argument that could have given Harriet a legitimate claim to at least a portion of the property George had promised her in front of 2 witnesses at a family gathering 7 years ago, the 40 acres in the North Quarter. A verbal promise, documented in memory, not on paper, possibly sufficient grounds for a challenge. Constance knew about this promise. Constance also knew that Harriet Voss would rather walk away from 40 acres than stand in a courthouse and beg for what should have been hers without asking. The trap was not built from cruelty. It was built from accurate knowledge of who Harriet was. The worst part, the part that Harriet turned over in her mind as she walked, was that Constance was right. She would not go to a courthouse. She would not argue and petition and perform the humiliation of public grievance. She had too much pride for that, and she knew it, and Constance knew it, and the farm was already lost. She walked the 5 miles to the land office at the settlement before noon. She asked about unclaimed parcels. The land agent, a young man with ink-stained fingers and the vaguely apologetic manner of someone who delivers news all day, showed her the survey maps. Most of the decent land within 10 miles had been claimed already. What remained was marginal. Poor soil, heavy timber, 2 parcels with drainage problems, 1 parcel with a half-mile of Rocky Creek frontage that made cultivation difficult. 1 parcel 5 miles north of the Voss farm was described in the survey notes as poorly drained, heavily wooded, with evidence of subsurface water, making it unsuitable for traditional crop farming. Nobody had filed on it. Nobody wanted it. Harriet studied the map for a long time. She filed the squatter's claim before she left the office. The land agent watched her go with the expression of a man who has just witnessed something he cannot quite categorize. She walked the 5 miles to the parcel that afternoon, arriving in the late heat of the August day, with her bag on her shoulder and the surveyor's description in her pocket. She stood at the edge of the tree lane and looked at what she had claimed. It was by every conventional measure the worst piece of available land in the county. The trees were dense second growth, the kind that springs up on disturbed or waterlogged soil. The ground underfoot was spongy in places, firm in others, without the reliable consistency that good farmland requires. The north end dropped slightly, creating a natural basin where water collected. There were no existing structures, no cleared fields, no evidence that anyone had ever tried to do anything useful with the place. She stood there for a long time without moving. Then she set down her bag and started walking the boundary. She had 10 weeks before the serious cold arrived. Minnesota Territory winters were not a challenge to be managed. They were a sentence to be survived or not survived. She had seen what happened to people who underestimated them. A family 3 miles east had lost 2 children in the winter of 1863 because the father had delayed cutting wood and the cold had arrived a week earlier than expected. A trapper she had known slightly had been found in February of 1861, 300 yards from his own cabin, frozen solid, having apparently become disoriented in a storm that lasted less than 4 hours. The cold did not negotiate. The cold did not care about your plans or your intentions or your previous experience with surviving it. To survive a Minnesota winter, you needed heat. Reliable, sustained heat that could maintain a livable interior temperature through nights that dropped to 30 below zero and days that did not rise much above that. The conventional solution was a cast iron stove which cost between $15 and $20, plus the construction of a chimney, which cost additional materials and labor. With $40 total, she could build rudimentary shelter, or she could heat it, but not both, not adequately. She sat down on a fallen log at the edge of the marshy north end of the parcel and opened her father's field journal. Her father had been a farmer in Ohio, a methodical man who wrote down everything he observed in the small, precise handwriting of someone who understood that memory is unreliable and paper is not. She had read this journal so many times over the years that she knew most of it from memory, but she opened it anyway to the entry from the winter of 1821 when she was 16 years old. He had written observed steam rising from the manure pile at first light. Temperature outside approximately 15 degrees. The center of the pile, when I probed it with the iron rod, was too hot to hold for more than a moment. Bacteria in decomposing organic matter generate heat as a byproduct of their metabolism. Father told me this when I was a boy. I have never seen it fail. A large enough pile will stay hot at the core through any winter we are likely to see in Ohio. She read that passage 3 times. Then she read the next entry. He had written, "If a man were poor enough and clever enough, he might consider whether this heat could be captured for some useful purpose. The pile does not care about the cold. The bacteria do not care about the cold. They care only about moisture and air and organic material. As long as those 3 things are present in the right proportions, the heat continues." She closed the journal. She sat on the log for another few minutes, listening to the birds in the second-growth trees, feeling the August heat on the back of her neck. She was 62 years old. She had $40 and a bag of clothing and a field journal and a piece of land that nobody wanted. She also had a memory and a father who had written things down. She began the calculations. A composting chamber large enough to heat a small structure would need to be substantial. 6 feet wide, 12 feet long, 6 feet high, 432 cubic feet of space, filled with layered organic material properly balanced between nitrogen-rich materials and carbon-rich materials, maintained at the correct moisture level, ventilated to allow aerobic bacterial activity. The heat generated by decomposition at that scale could reach 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit at the core. That heat conducted through a thick stone wall into an adjacent living space could maintain an interior temperature livable through a Minnesota winter. No stove, no chimney, no fuel costs beyond the labor of gathering and transporting materials that neighboring farms would give away for free, because they were waste. The concept was not complicated. Every farmer in the territory understood that manure piles generated heat. What none of them had apparently considered was whether that heat could be deliberately engineered for human use. It was the kind of idea that was obvious in retrospect and invisible until someone desperate enough to need it was also knowledgeable enough to recognize it. Harriet had spent 62 years becoming that person without knowing that was what she was doing. She spent the last days of August walking her parcel, learning its character systematically and without assumptions. She mapped the tree distribution, identifying which trees were straight enough and the right diameter for cabin logs. She located the marshy areas and the firm areas. She tested the soil at various points. She traced the path of water across the property during a rain shower, watching where it collected and where it drained. And she started digging. The north end of the parcel, the soggy basin where water collected, was the logical site for the cabin. This was counterintuitive. Wet land was bad land according to every conventional principle of frontier settlement. But Harriet was not building a conventional structure. She needed two things: that a low wet site provided drainage toward the north wall, which she could manage with proper construction and proximity to subsurface water. She dug the test holes herself 3 feet deep at 4 locations around the proposed building site. The first 2 produced damp soil and then standing water. The third produced something unexpected. She was 3 feet down, working in the close heat of a late August afternoon, when the spade broke through a thin layer of compacted clay into gravel, and water rose immediately around the blade, clear and cold and moving. A spring. Not a pool of surface water trapped by clay, but an actual spring, a subsurface stream moving through the gravel layer, continuous flow driven by pressure from higher ground to the north. She knelt in the hole and put her hand in the water. Cold, moving, constant. She understood immediately what she was looking at. This was why the land was considered worthless for farming. Subsurface water moving through the gravel meant the soil above never fully dried, never developed the reliable density that crops required. It meant drainage problems in every season, frost penetration in winter, complicated by freeze-thaw cycles in the gravel layer, unpredictable soil behavior during planting. For someone building a composting heating system, it was a different calculation entirely. The composting chamber required moisture. Constant, carefully managed moisture, enough to keep the bacterial activity aerobic and vigorous, without becoming so wet that the material turned anaerobic and stopped generating heat. On a normal site, maintaining that moisture through a Minnesota winter would mean hauling water from a creek that might freeze, managing supply against consumption, carrying heavy loads in conditions that made any physical labor punishing. The spring solved all of that. It would not freeze. It ran year-round through the gravel layer, accessible from the base of the composting chamber with proper construction. The moisture management problem, one of the most technically demanding aspects of the entire system, had just been largely solved by the specific character of land that nobody wanted. She sat at the edge of the hole for a long time, thinking about her father's field journal and the manure pile in Ohio and the 40 years she had spent on land that now belonged to someone else. The land she had just claimed was not worthless. It was precisely suited for what she needed it for. The people who had dismissed it had been measuring it against the wrong purpose. She began cutting timber the next morning. The work was the kind of work that does not announce itself as extraordinary while it is happening. It is only later, when you describe it to someone who has not done it, that the weight of it becomes apparent. She felled trees with a good axe she bought for $3 from the settlement hardware, selecting second-growth trunks 6 to 8 inches in diameter, straight-grained and sound. She limed them, cut them to length, notched the ends for corner joints. The cabin frame was 12 feet by 14 feet, walls 7 feet high. She built it in sections, one wall at a time, using wooden pins, and fitted notches where she could not afford iron hardware. Her hands, which had been calloused in the right places and rough everywhere else, developed new textures specific to the work. The axe handle wore a particular groove into the base of her right palm. The notching work built specific muscles along the inside of her left forearm. She was 62 years old, and she was building a cabin alone on land nobody else wanted, and the physical cost was real, measured in the deep ache across her shoulders every evening and the stiffness in her knees every morning that took the first hour of each day to work out. She did not stop. She adjusted. She planned each day's work to account for the mornings when she moved more slowly, and she rested in the middle heat of the afternoon when the timber work was less efficient anyway. She was not trying to prove something. She was trying to survive, which is a different and more practical motivation. The composting chamber went up after the cabin frame. This was the most technically demanding part of the construction, and she gave it the most careful attention. The chamber would be built against the north wall, the wall that faced the prevailing winter wind, making it simultaneously the coldest exterior face of the structure, and with the chamber built against it, the most thermally massive. She framed the chamber with vertical posts set every 4 feet horizontal bracing, creating a structural grid. The exterior wall was log construction, matching the rest of the cabin, 6-inch diameter logs chinked with moss and clay. The interior wall, the surface that would separate the composting material from the living space, was the critical element. She needed stone. Over 2 weeks in early September, she gathered fieldstones from the Rocky Creek bed a quarter-mile north of the cabin site. She was looking for specific qualities: relatively flat faces for stable dry, stacking sufficient mass to absorb and hold heat, limestone and granite in mixed proportion, because each behaved differently under thermal stress, and the combination was more stable than either alone. She hauled stones in a borrowed cart a neighbor 4 miles south had lent it without asking why she needed it, making the trip 3 and 4 times a day. The stones ranged from fist-sized pieces that she could carry in her apron to 50-pound slabs that she moved on a wooden sled she had rigged from 2 saplings. She estimated she moved 2 tons of stone in those 2 weeks. The dry stack wall rose slowly, 1 foot of height per day of careful work, selecting each stone for how it nested with its neighbors, testing stability before committing to placement, building layer by layer, with the patience of someone who understands that a wall that falls down has to be rebuilt, which means the time spent building it correctly the first time is never wasted. The finished wall was 2 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly to 18 inches at the top. 3,000 pounds of limestone and granite that would absorb heat from the composting material on one side and radiate it into the living space on the other. The ventilation system was simpler, but no less important. She left deliberate 6-inch gaps between logs at the base of the exterior chamber wall in 3 locations, and matching gaps at the top. Fresh air would enter through the bottom rise through the composting mass as convection carried warm air upward, and exit through the top gaps. This circulation would maintain the aerobic conditions the bacteria required. Without oxygen, the process would shift to anaerobic decomposition, slower, cooler, and producing gases she did not want accumulating inside a structure she was going to sleep in. The access door to the chamber was built on the exterior north face, thick planks hinged with leather straps tall enough to work through without bending, double-sealed, well enough against wind infiltration, without requiring complex hardware. The cabin was complete by the last week of September. She stood back and looked at it. It was small, 12 feet by 14 feet total, with the composting chamber occupying 6 feet of that width on the north side, leaving a living space 12 feet by 8 feet. The roof was simple rafters covered with bark and sod. There was no chimney, no stovepipe emerged from any surface. From the outside, it looked like someone had built a log structure and then forgotten to finish it. From the outside, it looked exactly like what a desperate old woman with $40 and no good options would build. Silas Greer rode past on the 3rd day of October. He was a large man, 66 years old, the kind of man who had been physically powerful in his youth and had kept enough of that to still carry authority in the way he occupied space. He had the largest farm in the district, 300 acres of good bottomland, 2 barns, a proper house with a parlor, and a cast-iron stove in every heated room. He had been a successful man for long enough that he had started to confuse his success with his judgment, which is a common and understandable mistake. He stopped his horse at the edge of the property and looked at the cabin for a long moment. His expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a man who believes he is looking at a mistake. Harriet was outside splitting kindling for the small outdoor cooking fire she used for meals. She did not stop splitting kindling. He said what he had come to say, or something near enough to it, that Minnesota winter was not forgiving of structural inadequacy, that a cabin without a stove was a cabin that would not keep a person alive. When January arrived, that there were options available to a woman in her situation, respectable arrangements, housekeeping, workroom and board, that did not require this kind of risk. She set another piece of kindling on the block and split it. He waited a moment. When she did not respond, he added, she would be dead before Christmas. She stacked the split kindling and picked up the next piece. He wrote on. She watched him go without expression, then turned back to her work. What Silas Greer did not know, what nobody in the district knew, was that the composting chamber had been loaded the previous week. 30 trips over 3 weeks in early September, borrowing the same cart, visiting farms up and down the settlement road and asking for manure and spoiled hay and bedding straw materials that every farm produced as waste and was grateful to have hauled away. She had layered the chamber methodically, 6 inches of straw, 3 inches of horse manure, 6 inches of hay, 3 inches of cow, manure, 6 inches of dead leaves, 3 inches of chicken and manure, repeating upward each layer, moistened carefully from the bucket she drew from the spring. The total mass in the chamber was 6 tons of carefully balanced organic material, 360 cubic feet, leaving 1 foot of space at the top for expansion and for adding fresh material as the season progressed. The biological process had begun almost immediately, just as she had calculated it would. Mesophilic bacteria moved first, working the readily available sugars and proteins, warming the mass from ambient temperature toward 90 degrees within 48 hours. As the temperature rose, thermophilic bacteria took over the heat-loving organisms that thrive above 120 degrees and break down complex compounds, including cellulose. Their metabolism highly exothermic, heat generating in a way that accelerated as temperature rose. By the time Silas Greer rode past and delivered his verdict, the stone wall of the composting chamber had been warmed to the touch for 6 days. The core of the 6-ton mass was approaching 140 degrees. The bacteria did not know it was October in Minnesota territory. They did not know that a 62-year-old woman had bet her survival on their appetite. They ate. They generated heat. The heat moved through 6 tons of organic material into 2 feet of limestone and granite, absorbed slowly, conducted through the thermal mass, and radiated from the interior surface into the living space of the cabin. On the morning of October 5th, 1867, for the first time in her life, Harriet Voss woke up in a warm room that contained no fire. She lay still for a moment, feeling the air temperature, registering the gentle warmth radiating from the north wall, hearing nothing but the quiet of the woods outside and the muffled sound of the wind, which had come up overnight, beginning its seasonal shift toward the cold patterns that would define the next 5 months. She got up and put her hand flat against the stone wall, warm, steadily, reliably warm, not hot, not uncomfortable, but warm in the way of something with real mass behind it, something that would not cool quickly, would not fluctuate with every passing cloud or shift of wind. She held her hand there for a long moment. Then she picked up her father's field journal from the shelf beside her sleeping pallet and opened it to the 1821 entry. She read the passage about the manure pile and the iron rod and the bacteria that did not care about the cold. She closed the journal and set it back on the shelf. There was work to do. The first week of October arrived with the particular cruelty that Minnesota territory reserved for people who were not yet ready for it. Not the deep cold of January, not the killing temperatures that would come later, but a preview, a reminder. Temperatures that dropped to 28 degrees at night and climbed only to 45 during the day, with a wind off the northwest that had nothing to stop it for 500 miles and knew it. Harriet worked in that wind without complaint, splitting the last of her cooking wood, banking the outdoor fire pit against the worst of the gusts, checking the exterior ventilation gaps on the chamber wall to ensure they had not been blocked by early leaf fall. The gaps mattered. Oxygen was the variable. She could not see the invisible requirement that determined whether the bacteria lived and worked or suffocated and went quiet. She checked them every morning and every evening, clearing debris with a stick she kept by the door for that purpose, feeling for the faint exhale of warm air from the upper gaps that told her that convection was moving correctly. The cabin interior held at 57 degrees on a night when the outside temperature dropped to 22. She measured this with the small thermometer she had bought from the settlement doctor for 50 cents, hanging it from a nail on the interior wall, away from the heat source, away from the door, in the most neutral air she could find. 57 degrees. She was wearing 2 dresses and a wool shawl, and she was not cold. She had not lit a fire inside the cabin. There was no stove to light. She wrote the number in her father's field journal below his entries from 1821 and noted the outside temperature and the wind direction and the state of the composting material as best she could estimate it from the probe measurements she took each morning. She was building a record, not for anyone else, for herself, because she was a woman who had learned from a man who wrote things down that observation without documentation is just memory, and memory is unreliable. The stone wall temperature, measured by pressing the back of her hand flat against different points of the surface, varied by location in ways she found illuminating. Near the top of the wall, where the freshest and most actively decomposing material sat, the surface was noticeably warmer. Near the bottom, where older material had been working for weeks and its readily available nutrients were beginning to exhaust, the surface was cooler. The gradient created a gentle movement of air in the cabin, warm air rising near the upper portion of the wall, slightly cooler air settling near the floor, a natural convection that distributed heat across the small space more evenly than a stove in one corner would have managed. She noted this too. On the 14th of October, Prudence Greer arrived. She did not come alone. She came with 4 other women from the district, all of them wives of successful farmers, all of them wearing good wool coats and carrying the expressions of people who have organized themselves around a charitable purpose and intend to see it through. Prudence was 61 years old, a tall woman with sharp features in the kind of composed manner that takes decades to develop and is sometimes mistaken for coldness. She was not a cold woman. She was a woman who had learned that composure was more useful than emotion in most situations and had applied that lesson consistently for 40 years. She had organized this visit because she believed genuinely and without malice that Harriet Voss was going to die in that cabin before the serious winter arrived, and that someone should make a final attempt to persuade her to accept a sensible alternative before it was too late to matter. The women came through the tree line and stopped. They had expected something that confirmed the rumors: a sod inadequate structure, a desperate arrangement, something that looked like what it was: a 62-year-old widow with $40 trying to survive a Minnesota winter through stubbornness alone. The cabin was small, certainly, and there was no chimney, no stovepipe, exactly as reported. But it did not look desperate. It looked deliberate. The logs were carefully fitted and chinked. The roof was solid. The north wall was visibly thicker than the others, massive, in a way that suggested intention rather than improvisation. There was a neat woodpile beside the door, split kindling, stacked with the precision of someone who does things correctly, whether anyone is watching or not. Harriet was at the outdoor fire pit when they arrived, heating water for the midday meal. She looked up, registered the group, set her pot down, and waited for them to come to her. Prudence delivered her speech. It was a considerate speech, as these things go. It acknowledged Harriet's difficult situation without rubbing it in. It noted the approaching winter with appropriate gravity. It outlined several options that the community had collectively discussed: a housekeeping arrangement with the Hadley family, who needed help and had a warm house; a room at the settlement boarding house in exchange for cooking assistance; a possible arrangement with the church that would provide shelter and a small income. Harriet listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she asked them, "So come inside." Prudence hesitated. The other women looked at each other, but they followed her through the low door and into the cabin interior, and what happened next was something none of them had prepared for. It was warm, not blazing, not the fierce, dry heat of a well-stoked stove that hits your face when you enter from cold air. Something different and stranger, and in its own way more unsettling. A steady ambient warmth, like the interior of a living thing, that met them at the door and did not diminish as they moved further inside. The thermometer on the wall read 58 degrees. Outside at that moment it was 34. Prudence stood in the middle of the room and looked at the north wall. There was no stove, no fireplace, no source of heat that she could identify. Just one wall that was thicker than the others, built of carefully stacked stone, radiating a warmth that she could feel on her face when she turned toward it. Harriet explained it the way she explained everything, directly without dramatizing it, as though the facts were sufficient, and usually were. The composting chamber, the layered organic material, the bacterial decomposition generating heat as a byproduct of metabolism, the stone wall conducting that heat into the living space. The same process that made manure piles steam on cold mornings, engineered and contained and directed toward a specific purpose. One of the women, the youngest of the group, said something about the smell. Harriet acknowledged it. There was an occasional faint odor, especially in the first weeks, especially when she added fresh material. She had managed it through the ventilation design and the careful carbon-to-nitrogen balance of the layering. In cold weather with the door closed, it was not worse than the smell of a nearby barn. Prudence was quiet for a long time. She was a woman who prided herself on accurate assessment, and what she was assessing did not fit into any category she had previously used. She put her hand on the stone wall. Warm, genuinely warm. She pressed harder, feeling the heat radiating through the stone with the slow, reliable character of something with real mass behind it. She said, "This cannot possibly hold through January." Harriet said, "We will see." The women left. Harriet watched them go, then went back to her pot of water. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the way she usually felt when she had done something correctly, satisfied in a functional sense, ready to move on to the next thing that needed doing. What she did not know, standing at her outdoor fire pit watching the group of women disappear into the tree line, was that Silas Greer had been to her property twice already in October. Not to speak to her, not to offer advice or charity or the verdict of a successful man surveying someone else's poor decisions. He had come alone on 2 mornings when he had told Prudence he was riding the fence line of the east pasture. He had stood at the edge of the trees and looked at the cabin for 15 or 20 minutes each time, not moving, just looking the way a man looks at something he cannot categorize. He came a third time in the first week of November. This time Harriet saw him before he had decided whether to approach. She was outside at first light, checking the upper ventilation gaps, and she looked up, and he was there at the tree line sitting his horse watching. She said, "You can come in if you want to see it." He sat for another moment. Then he dismounted and tied his horse to a branch and walked across the yard and through the door. He stood inside for 10 minutes. He did not say much. He put his hand on the stone wall the way Prudence had. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the ceiling as though searching for the stovepipe that should have been there and was not. He crouched down near the base of the wall where it was coolest, and then stood and moved to the upper portion where it was warmest, registering the temperature gradient with the methodical attention of a farmer who is accustomed to measuring things. He said, "How long will the material keep generating heat?" She told him as long as she added fresh material every 10 to 14 days. The older material cooled as its nutrients depleted, but stayed warm longer than he might expect due to the thermal mass of the surrounding material. The fresh material she added on top would begin its hot phase within 48 hours. The system was self-sustaining, provided the inputs were maintained. He stood there for another minute. Then he said, "I told you that you would be dead before Christmas." She said, "You did." He looked at the wall again. Then he said something she did not expect. He said, "I was wrong." He went out the door and got his horse and rode away, and he did not tell Prudence where he had been. Harriet noted the visit in her field journal with the date and the outside temperature, and Silas's question about heat duration. She noted it not because she thought it would matter later, but because she noted everything, and because a man who asks a specific technical question about a system he publicly dismissed is a man whose opinion is in the process of changing. That seemed worth documenting. November deepened. The cold moved in with intention. Temperatures at night dropped regularly to 10 above 0 to 5 occasionally below. The wind off the northwest picked up and held. The day shortened until the light was gone by 4 in the afternoon, leaving long evenings of dark and cold that tested the endurance of everything built to withstand them. The cabin held at 55 degrees through the worst of the November cold snaps. When the outside temperature dropped to -10, the interior maintained 53 degrees, a difference of 63 degrees, sustained entirely by biological heat generation and the thermal mass of 2 feet of stone. She added fresh material on schedule every 12 days, carrying it in the same borrowed cart from the same farms down the settlement road. The farmers had stopped asking why she needed it. They had heard something about what she was doing, imprecise versions of it filtered through the district gossip, and most of them found it somewhere between eccentric and incomprehensible. But the material was waste regardless, and someone hauling it away was still a convenience. She loaded the cart with horse manure and straw, and spoiled hay hauled it to the property, forked it through the access door in careful layers, moistened it from the bucket she drew from the spring. The spring. She thought about the spring every time she drew from it. The subsurface water running through gravel, not freezing, not varying in temperature or flow, regardless of what the air above it was doing. She thought about the land agent's survey notes describing the property as poorly drained, and unsuitable for cultivation, and she thought about the fact that the specific quality that made the land worthless for one purpose had made it essential for another. She thought about Constance, who had used accurate knowledge of Harriet's character to build a trap. She thought about how the land she had been forced to accept the worst available, the land nobody wanted, had turned out to contain exactly what she needed. She did not find poetry in this. She found instruction. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept the things that were useful to know about how the world worked. The crisis arrived in the last week of October, before the November cold had fully established itself, and it arrived without warning in the middle of the night. She woke at 2 in the morning to a sensation she had not felt inside the cabin since the first days of construction cold. Not the ambient cool of a room that was adequately heated, but not hot. The specific cold of a room where the heat source had failed. She lay still for a moment, registering it, then reached for the candle and the flint. The thermometer read 41 degrees. She was out of her blankets before the reading had fully processed. She put her hand on the stone wall and pulled it back. Not cold, not exactly, but wrong. The warmth that had been reliably there for 3 weeks was diminished in a way that was immediately physically wrong, like pressing your hand against a person's forehead and finding it cooler than it should be. She dressed in everything she had. Then she opened the exterior access door into the October night, and the cold came in like something that had been waiting. She worked by the light of the single candle set inside the access doorway, shielded from the wind with her body. The iron probe told her what she already feared: the anaerobic shift had been building for at least 2 days. She should have seen it coming. The readings over the previous week had shown the peak temperature zone dropping incrementally from 150 degrees to 135 to 120, each reading within the range she might attribute to normal fluctuation, each reading actually a step in a direction she had not identified until it was complete. The bottom 3 feet of the mass had gone quiet. Not dead, but cold in a way that would spread upward if she did not stop it tonight. The subsurface spring, her great advantage, the feature that had made the system possible in the first place, had been seeping laterally into the lower chamber material through a point she had not adequately sealed when she built the floor drain. The moisture content at the base of the mass had climbed past 60%, past 65. The aerobic bacteria needed air as much as they needed moisture, and at the base of a 6-ton pile with too much water compressing the lower layers, air circulation had collapsed. The thermophilic bacteria had gone dormant. The anaerobic bacteria, the cold, slow ones, the ones that produced the wrong gases and generated almost no heat, had taken over the bottom third of the chamber while she slept. She sat back on her heels in the doorway, with the -5 wind on her face and the candle guttering between her knees, and she thought, what if she had calculated wrong from the beginning? What if the spring was the variable she had not accounted for correctly? What if Silas Greer had been right in October and she had simply not died yet? She sat with that thought for approximately 1 minute. Then she picked up the pitchfork. She was not a woman who allowed herself extended time with thoughts that had no productive outcome. She had the problem. She had the materials to address it. She had until dawn before the cold made the work impossible. Those were the facts. She worked with the facts. She needed to break the compaction in the lower material and restore air circulation. She needed to add dry carbon material to absorb the excess moisture. She needed to physically turn the bottom layer to expose dormant thermophilic bacteria to fresh oxygen and kick the metabolic process back into its active phase. With a 6-ton mass, she could not turn the entire chamber. But she could work through the access door, reaching as deep as the handle of the pitchfork allowed, breaking and loosening and mixing, adding armloads of the driest straw she had stored under the lean-to. She worked for 4 hours. Her shoulders burned past the point where burning meant anything. Her hands, even through the leather work gloves, went from cold and numb to a deep, specific ache that told her she was at the edge of what sustained, gripping work in this temperature would allow. She stopped twice to go inside and warm her hands over the small cooking fire she had built in the fire pit, standing close enough to feel her fingers returning to something like function, then going back out into the dark to work the pitchfork again. At some point in the 3rd hour, kneeling on the ground outside the access door, with her face close to the base of the material, she smelled the change. A shift from the flat, slightly sweet smell of anaerobic activity to something sharper and earthier. The smell of aerobic decomposition resuming. The smell of bacteria waking up. She sat back and felt something that was not triumph and was not relief and was not quite either of those things. It was the specific sensation of a calculation that had been wrong becoming right again. It lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then she went back to adding straw. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, she had the floor drains sealed with packed clay and a new layer of limestone chips she had been keeping for another purpose. She had added 200 pounds of dry straw in careful layers. She had broken the compaction through the accessible lower third of the mass and restored visible air circulation through the bottom ventilation gaps, confirmed by holding her hand near each gap and feeling the inward draw of fresh air replacing the warm exhaust at the top. She sealed the access door and went inside. The thermometer read 39 degrees. It would have been lower without the cooking fire she had running. She added fuel to the fire pit, put on water to heat, sat down with her back against the south wall and waited. She did not sleep. She watched the thermometer. By mid-morning, the reading had climbed to 44 degrees. By early afternoon, 48. By evening, the wall was warm again to the touch at the upper portion, the thermophilic bacteria resuming their hot phase work in the fresh material, the heat beginning its slow conduction back through the stone. 48 degrees was not sufficient for a comfortable night. She slept in all her layers with the 2 blankets pulled close, and she was cold in the way you are cold when the heat source is recovering, rather than absent an uncomfortable cold, rather than a dangerous one. By the third morning after the crisis, the wall was reading 92 degrees at the surface. By the end of the week, it was back to its normal operating range. She wrote the date and the sequence of events in the field journal with the same care she gave to every entry. She noted the cause: inadequate floor drainage, allowing lateral seepage into the lower material. She noted the correction clay seal plus limestone chip layer plus restored compaction management. She noted the lesson: the spring was an asset with one specific failure mode she had not fully anticipated, and that failure mode required permanent structural mitigation rather than reactive management. She did not write about the hours she had spent in the October dark with the candle and the pitchfork sitting on her heels, with -5 wind on her face, thinking about whether she had been wrong from the beginning. Some things did not need to be written down because they did not need to be forgotten. Not a person in the district knew that the crisis had occurred or that it had been resolved. When Silas Greer rode past the following week and saw the cabin exactly as it had been, smoke from the small outdoor cooking fire, the warm wall visible in the faint exhale of the upper ventilation gaps, he saw nothing that suggested anything had changed. November deepened and the system held. The cold moved in with its full intention, and the wall held against it with the patience of 6 tons of material, doing the slow work of biological chemistry, unchanged by the opinions of the people 1 mile south who burned 3/4 of a cord of wood per week to achieve roughly the same interior temperature. December arrived and settled over Minnesota territory with its full authority. The temperature dropped and stayed dropped. The sky took on the flat white quality of serious winter, the sun low and distant and providing light without warmth. The creek between the settlement road and Harriet's property iced over completely in the first week of December, and the secondary road through the timber became difficult to travel as snow accumulated and drifted against the trees. Harriet moved her outdoor cooking operations partially under a lean-to she had built against the east wall of the cabin, using leftover log sections and bark roofing. She cooked 1 hot meal per day in the middle of the day, managing her small supply of cooking wood with the precision of someone who understands that waste is a form of failure. The rest of her nutrition came from the stores she had accumulated through the fall: dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, dried apples, hard cheese she had made in October from milk she had bartered for with early turnips from her small emergency garden. She was not comfortable in the way that people with warm houses and full larders are comfortable. She was adequately sustained, which was a different and sufficient thing. The chamber maintained its temperatures through December's deepening cold. When the outside temperature dropped to -15 on a night in the second week of December, the interior of the cabin held at 52 degrees. She was wearing all her layers and the 2 good wool blankets, and she was not cold. She did exercises in the evenings before sleeping, a kind of deliberate movement that keeps blood circulating and joints from stiffening, and she slept adequately and woke with the particular alertness of someone whose survival is an ongoing project rather than a background assumption. She measured the wall temperature every morning. She added fresh material on the 12th day of each cycle, noting the outside conditions and the chamber response in the field journal. The record she was building was thorough enough now to show patterns she had only theorized in August. The temperature differential between exterior and interior was reliably proportional to the freshness of the material in the upper chamber section. Adding fresh material produced a measurable increase in wall temperature within 36 hours. The peak temperature in the active zone was consistently between 140 and 160 degrees regardless of outside conditions, as long as moisture and ventilation were maintained correctly. The system was not a rough approximation of what she had planned. It was performing almost exactly as she had calculated it would from her father's field journal and her own reasoning on a log at the edge of a marshy property in August. The crisis in October had revealed one design flaw, and she had corrected it. The corrected system was stronger than the original. She thought about the Greer farm 1 mile away where Silas and Prudence were burning through their winter wood supply at a rate she had heard described at the general store the previous week. 3/4 of a cord per week. At commercial rates, that was approximately $35 a month. Over a full Minnesota winter, 6 months of real cold, that was $200 in fuel. $200 that the Voss farm had spent every winter for 40 years. That farms throughout the district spent every winter that was simply accepted as the cost of not dying. Her fuel cost for the month of November was zero. Her fuel cost for December was zero. She had spent her remaining money on spring garden seed and a replacement axe handle and 2 good wool blankets. She was not preparing to survive the winter. She was preparing for what came after it. She turned 63 on the 21st of December. The solstice, the longest night of the year in a year that had contained a great many long nights. She ate a slightly better dinner than usual salt pork, with dried apple and cornmeal cooked together into something almost festive, and she sat after dinner in the warmth from the stone wall and read her father's field journal from the beginning. Not just the passages about decomposition, but all of it, the planting records and the weather observations and the small careful notes about what worked and what did not, and why the accumulated wisdom of a man who had paid attention to the world around him for 60 years and written it down so that it would not be lost. She thought about what he would have made of what she had built. She thought he would have asked good questions about the ventilation design, and then about the floor drainage, and she would have had better answers for him after October than she would have had before it. She was smiling slightly when she closed the journal, which surprised her because she had not been aware that there was anything to smile at. It was in the last week of November that a different kind of trouble had arrived, though she had not known it was trouble at all when it first appeared. She became aware of it the way you become aware of weather changing before you can see the clouds through a change in the quality of something ordinary. She had gone to the settlement to buy lamp oil, and the storekeeper, a man named Burl Petty, who knew everything about everyone in the district in the way that storekeepers in small settlements do, had been awkward with her in a way he had not been before. Not unfriendly, just slightly too careful. The way a man is careful when he knows something he is not sure he should say. She had let it pass. She bought the oil and came home, but she thought about it. She did not have enough information yet to understand what it meant. She filed it in the part of her mind reserved for incomplete observations that might become significant later. And she went back to the work of maintaining the chamber and recording her temperature measurements and splitting cooking wood in the cold, clear air of late November. What she did not know was that in the first week of November, Constance Voss had visited the office of a lawyer in the county seat. Constance had done what Constance always did. She had studied the rules carefully and found the one that served her purpose. The specific language of the territorial squatters' claim statute included a provision that land containing documented drainage impediments could be challenged as unsuitable for the intended agricultural purpose, which was the legal basis on which squatters' claims were granted in the first place. Constance had found the survey notes describing Harriet's parcel as poorly drained, with evidence of subsurface water, and she had used them to file a formal challenge to Harriet's claim. The challenge would be heard by the county land office in March of 1868. If it succeeded, Harriet would lose the land. She would lose it not through poverty or failure or the winter she was supposed to have died in before Christmas, but through the same mechanism that had taken the farm paperwork filed by someone who had read the rules more carefully than the person they were being used against. Constance had waited until November to file late enough that Harriet would not learn of it before winter locked the territory into its months of enforced isolation when there was nothing to be done about it regardless. It was elegant in the way that cold calculations are elegant, not cruel, just efficient. Silas Greer's friend at the county clerk's office sent him a note about the filing in the second week of November. Silas read it twice, folded it, and put it in the top drawer of his desk. He sat there for a long time. He did not tell Prudence. He did not ride to Harriet's property. He put the note in the drawer and closed it, and he told himself that he was waiting to understand the situation better, which was not entirely untrue and also not entirely the reason. The cold deepened into January with the slow inevitability of something that has been building since October and has finally arrived at its full expression. The temperature on the morning of January 6th was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind had been blowing from the northwest for 4 days without significant pause, and the snow that had fallen in late December had drifted against every windward surface in the territory to depths that made normal movement between farms nearly impossible. At the Greer farm 1 mile south, they were burning through wood at a rate that was becoming alarming even to Silas, who had laid in what he considered a generous supply in October. The two stoves, the parlor stove and the kitchen stove, ran continuously. The house, a proper frame house with 3 heated rooms and better construction than most in the district, held at 50 degrees on the coldest nights when they pushed the fires hard. 50 degrees was survivable. It was not comfortable. Prudence wore her coat indoors. The 2 hired men who lived in the bunkhouse behind the main building spent the evenings huddled over the small stove in there, burning wood faster than Silas had budgeted for that structure. He stood at the window of the parlor on the evening of January 6th and looked north through the bare trees toward where Harriet's cabin sat in the dark. He went to the desk and opened the drawer and took out the note. He read it again, though he knew what it said. The challenge to Harriet's claim would be heard in March. If she was going to respond to it, she needed to know about it before March. She needed a lawyer, or at minimum, a written response to file with the land office. In the depths of a Minnesota January, with roads drifting closed and temperatures that made a 1-mile ride a serious physical undertaking, there was no practical way for Harriet to do anything about legal paperwork she did not know existed, unless someone told her. He put the note back in the drawer. Then he took it out again. Prudence came into the parlor and saw him standing at the desk with the paper in his hand. She asked what it was. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. He said nothing that won't keep until morning. He said it knowing that morning would bring the early edge of something the barometric pressure had been warning about for 2 days. The pattern of a sustained Arctic outbreak. The kind of weather that settled over Minnesota territory for days at a time and killed people who were not prepared for it. The kind of weather that did not care about your stove or your wood supply or your 40 years of experience surviving Minnesota winters. He went to bed with the note in his coat pocket against his chest. Outside, the temperature was falling toward the threshold of serious danger, and the wind had not paused for breath in 6 days, and somewhere 1 mile north through the black frozen timber, the stone wall of Harriet Voss's composting chamber was warm. It had been warm every night since October. It would be warm tomorrow. The storm arrived before dawn on January 9th. It did not arrive the way ordinary storms arrive, with a period of building and a period of peak and a period of diminishing. It arrived at full force as though it had been at full force for 1,000 miles, and simply extended that force to include this particular piece of Minnesota territory without adjusting anything. The temperature at first light was minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was sustained at 70 miles per hour, with gusts that hit the cabin walls like something deliberate, like something that had a reason for what it was doing. The snow did not fall so much as it moved horizontally, driven by the wind into every gap and crack, an imperfection in every structure in the territory, accumulating against windward walls in drifts that built and shifted and built again. Harriet had been awake since midnight. She had felt the change in the air pressure the previous afternoon, the particular quality of the atmosphere before a serious Arctic outbreak, and she had spent the evening hours preparing with the methodical thoroughness that had characterized every action she had taken since August. She had brought the remaining cooking wood inside and stacked it against the south wall. She had drawn 6 full buckets from the spring and lined them inside the cabin. She had checked the composting chamber access door 3 times, reinforcing the seal with an additional wedge of wood against the bottom edge to prevent wind infiltration that might disrupt the ventilation pattern. She had eaten a full hot meal at 9 in the evening, more than she usually ate, understanding that her body's ability to generate heat from within was part of the overall system. She had done these things without anxiety. Anxiety was not a useful tool in her situation. She had assessed the threat accurately, prepared for it thoroughly, and was now in the position of someone who has done what can be done and is waiting to observe the results. The storm did what storms do. It raged. Inside the cabin, the temperature held at 52 degrees. She sat wrapped in her 2 wool blankets with the field journal open on her knees, not writing, just feeling the warmth from the stone wall on her left side and listening to the storm try to get in. It was loud in a way that was almost impressive, the wind finding harmonics in the log walls, the roof flexing slightly under gusts, the sound of driven snow against the exterior, a continuous low percussion. But the walls held. The roof held. And the composting chamber on the north side, directly in the path of the prevailing wind, the coldest and most exposed wall of the structure, was warm. The thermophilic bacteria in the 6-ton mass did not know it was minus 35 outside. They knew moisture. They knew oxygen. They knew organic material. All three were present in the correct proportions, the floor drainage properly sealed. Since the October crisis, the lateral seepage eliminated the ventilation balanced. They ate. They generated heat. The heat moved through the mass into the stone, and the stone held it and released it slowly into the room. And Harriet Voss sat in a 52-degree cabin in the worst storm in recent memory and was not dying. By noon of the first day, she knew the storm would last at least 3 days. The pressure had not changed. The wind had not swept. This was not a storm that was passing through. This was a system that had parked itself over the territory and intended to stay until it had finished what it came to do. She did exercises. She ate carefully. She slept in intervals, waking to check the thermometer and note the reading in the journal. She was 63 years old and alone in a 12 by 8-foot room, and she was adequately warm and not afraid. And that was, by any reasonable measure, everything. What she could not know inside those walls, with the wind making knowledge of the outside world impossible, was what was happening at the Greer farm 1 mile south. It was not going well. The 2 stoves that had maintained 50 degrees on ordinary cold nights were losing ground by the afternoon of the first day. The frame house was better built than most structures in the district, but it had been built with the assumption that the stoves would be the primary defense against cold, and the stoves required wood, and the wood pile was outside, and outside was no longer a place where a person could go and come back from without risk of not coming back at all. Silas had managed 1 trip to the woodpile on the morning of January 9th before the storm reached its full intensity. He had brought in what he could carry in 2 loads and stacked it inside the parlor. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough when he stacked it. He stacked it anyway because it was what there was to do. By the evening of the first day, the parlor temperature was 48 degrees, with both stoves burning steadily. Prudence wore her coat and her shawl and sat close to the parlor stove and did not say what she was thinking. The 2 hired men had come in from the bunkhouse in the early afternoon when it became clear the small bunkhouse stove could not compete with the temperature differential. 6 people in the main house, now 6 people sharing 2 stoves and a wood supply that was visibly mathematically insufficient for what the storm appeared to intend. Silas stood at the parlor window and looked north into the white chaos and could not see the tree line 20 feet away. He put his hand in his coat pocket and felt the folded note there where it had been since the night before the storm began. He had slept with it against his chest. He had eaten breakfast with it in his pocket. It had traveled with him through 2 trips to the woodpile in the early storm hours, and it was still there, a piece of paper that said something he had known for 6 weeks and had not done anything about. The second day was worse. The temperature inside the frame house dropped to 43 degrees despite burning continuously. They had started burning a chair on the afternoon of the second day, a straight-back kitchen chair that Prudence had owned for 20 years, brought from her parents' house in Wisconsin. She watched it go into the stove without protest. She was a practical woman. She understood the hierarchy of things. One of the hired men, a young man named Amos, who was 19 years old and had never seen a winter this severe, began shaking in the mid-afternoon of the second day in a way that was not ordinary cold shivering. It was deeper than that, less controlled, and it did not stop when he moved closer to the stove. Prudence recognized it. She had seen mild hypothermia before in her father's hired men in Wisconsin on a bad winter years ago. The body beginning to lose the argument with the cold. She made him drink hot water from the pot she kept on the stove surface. She put him in the main bedroom with every blanket they had. She closed the bedroom door to concentrate the stove's output into the main room and hoped the bed warmth would be sufficient. Silas stood at the window on the morning of the third day and looked at the number on the indoor thermometer. 40 degrees. He had not slept. He had been feeding wood into both stoves through the night, burning at a rate that had consumed the last of the accessible indoor supply and required him to go to the covered side porch twice in the dark hours, fighting wind and cold and disorientation for stacks of wood 40 feet from the door. His hands had not fully warmed from the second trip. He was 66 years old, and he was standing in his own house in a 40-degree room, and he was beginning to understand something about what adequate heating actually required to be adequate. He pressed his hand flat against the note through the wool of his coat. Then he went to find Prudence. He told her what he was going to do. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You will not make it." He said, "The alternative is staying here and seeing what 40 degrees becomes by tomorrow morning." She said, "Take Amos." He said, "Amos cannot travel." She said nothing after that, which was her form of consent when she had no better argument. He dressed in everything he had, every layer. He tied cloth over his face, leaving only a narrow gap for vision. He took the lantern, which the wind would extinguish within 30 seconds of going outside, so he set it back down. He had made the walk between this farm and the property to the north perhaps 100 times in the years he had lived here. He knew the land. He would use the tree line as a guide, keeping it on his left moving north. He opened the door. The cold hit him like a physical object. Not a temperature, but a force, something with mass and intention, and the wind behind it had been building for 3 days and had not tired. He stepped off the porch and the door blew shut behind him, and the world became white and loud and entirely indifferent to his presence in it. He walked. He could not see more than 4 feet in any direction. He kept the tree line on his left, feeling for it. When the wind-driven snow reduced visibility to nothing, finding a trunk with his gloved hand and using it as a reference point before moving forward again. His boots found drifts that were 2 feet deep and then firm ground and then drifts again. He fell twice in the first quarter mile. The second fall was harder than the first, and he lay for a moment in the snow, with the wind screaming over him, and felt with the particular clarity that serious cold produces in the mind that he could stay there. That staying was an option. That the effort of getting up was very large, and the cold beneath him was almost comfortable in its pressure. He got up, he walked. He was thinking about several things as he walked in the fragmented way that the mind works when it is cold and working hard and beginning to narrow its focus to the immediate. He was thinking about Harriet Voss arriving at the land office in August with $40 and choosing the parcel everyone else had rejected. He was thinking about his own visit to her cabin in early November. The hand on the warm stone wall, the thermometer reading. He had not expected the ride home in which he had not told Prudence where he had been, because telling her would have required him to admit what he had seen. He was thinking about the note in his coat pocket and the 6 weeks it had spent first in his desk drawer and then traveling with him every day as a permanent passenger he had not known how to deliver. He had told himself several versions of the reason over those weeks, that he was waiting for the right moment, that the roads were difficult, that he needed to understand the situation better before acting. Walking through a January blizzard with his hands going numb and the wind finding every gap in his layers, he was done pretending those reasons were the actual reason. The actual reason was simpler and less flattering. He had not wanted to be wrong. He had told her she would be dead before Christmas, and he had been wrong about that, and delivering the note would have required him to appear in front of her as someone who needed to give her something, which was an acknowledgement of a kind of debt he had not been ready to acknowledge. He had been protecting his own sense of his own judgment instead of doing what was right. He had done it while the note sat in the drawer. He found the cabin by almost walking into the north wall. He felt the logs with his hands, moved along the wall to the east, found the corner, came around to the south face, found the door. He knocked. He was not sure in his current state whether his knock was audible over the wind. He knocked again, harder. The door opened. Warm air came out of that door and hit him in the face like a hand pressed gently against his cheek, and the contrast between the air inside and the air outside was so absolute that his body responded before his mind did, leaning toward the warmth involuntarily, the way a plant leans toward light. Harriet stood in the doorway. She looked at him without surprise, the way she looked at most things, registering and assessing before responding. She saw the ice on his coat, in his covered face, and his gloved hands gripping the doorframe for support. She stepped back and let him in and closed the door behind him. He stood in the middle of the room and did not speak immediately. He was feeling the temperature around him, 53 degrees of still air after the screaming cold outside, and his hands were beginning to signal their return to circulation with the particular pain that means the damage is not permanent, which is a pain worth feeling. He reached into his coat and took out the folded note. His hands were not working well enough to unfold it cleanly. He held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it and read it. He watched her face. She read it twice. She folded it again and held it in her hand for a moment. Then she set it on the shelf beside her father's field journal. He said, "I should have brought it to you sooner." She looked at him. She said, "Yes." Then she said, "How bad is it at your place?" He told her. The temperature, the wood supply, Amos, the chairs. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Go back and bring whoever can travel. The cabin is small, but it is warm enough for several people. Go now before it gets worse." He looked at her. He said, "You would do that?" She said, "I would do that." Go. He went back out into the storm. It took him longer to make the return trip than the outward journey had taken, because the wind had shifted slightly and was no longer at his back for any portion of the route, and because his body had used significant reserves on the first crossing. But he made it. He came through his own door and told Prudence what he had found, what Harriet had said, what they were going to do. Prudence looked at him for a long moment. She said that. He said she said that. Prudence turned and began gathering blankets. They came in two groups because moving everyone at once in those conditions was not manageable. Silas brought Prudence and Amos, first supporting Amos between them, the young man moving slowly but moving. The second trip brought the other hired man, a taciturn man named Bertrand, who was 44 years old and had worked the Greer farm for 11 years and said almost nothing under any circumstances. A neighbor woman named Vera Stanton, 60 years old, who had been at the Greer farm since the storm began because her own cabin, half a mile further east, had become untenable on the first day, and she had made the walk to the Greers before conditions made it impossible. 6 people came through the door of Harriet's cabin in the space of 3 hours on the third day of the storm. 6 people in a 12 by 8-foot room with a stone wall that had been warm since October. The temperature in the cabin rose with the addition of 6 bodies generating heat. It reached 58 degrees and held there the combined output of 6 people and 1 composting chamber, reaching equilibrium with the heat loss through the log walls in the roof. 58 degrees. They were wearing their layers and they were cramped, and the floor space was entirely consumed by the arrangements of sitting and lying and moving carefully around each other. But they were warm, genuinely sustainably warm. Warm in a way that did not depend on the next trip to the woodpile, or the remaining thickness of the winter supply, or the endurance of a stove that had been running at maximum output for 3 days. Amos's shaking stopped within 2 hours. He fell asleep against the east wall with 2 blankets over him and did not wake for 10 hours. Prudence sat beside the stone wall with her hand pressed against it, the way she had in October, the way she had dismissed in October. She did not say anything for a long time. She was a woman who prided herself on accurate assessment, and she was doing that now, and the assessment was not comfortable, and she was doing it anyway. After a while, she said, "I owe you an apology." Harriet was across the room tending the small cooking fire she used for the pot of dried bean soup she had put together from her stores to feed 6 people. She said, "You owe me nothing." Prudence said, "I organized that visit in October. I brought those women here to persuade you to give this up. I was certain you would die." Harriet said, "You were uncertain I would survive. That is different from wanting me to fail." Prudence was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It was the same thing from where you were standing." Harriet ladled soup into the single bowl she owned and handed it to Amos, who had woken briefly and was conscious enough to eat. She said, "Perhaps. But here we all are." Vera Stanton sat near the base of the wall where the temperature was least extreme, her back against the stone, and she had not said a word since she came through the door. She was a quiet woman under ordinary circumstances, and these were not ordinary circumstances, and she was using the silence to understand something. She had her palm flat on the stone surface, and she was not moving it. She was 60 years old and she had lived in Minnesota territory for 11 years, and she had never felt anything like what she was feeling through that stone, and she was going to understand it completely before she said anything about it to anyone. Silas sat in the corner nearest the door, which was the least warm spot in the room, and he thought about the note he had carried in his coat pocket. He thought about the 6 weeks it had spent first in his desk drawer, and then against his chest, the conversation with himself he had been conducting the entire time about why he had not yet delivered it. He had been protecting his own sense of his own judgment instead of doing what was right. He had done it while the note sat in the drawer, and the weeks passed, and the challenge filing moved toward its March hearing date. In this cabin, in this heat that required no fire with 6 people alive, because of a system that everyone, including himself, had dismissed, he was done making it more complicated than it was. He sat in the corner of the warm cabin and looked at the stone wall for a long while. Then he said, "When the storm breaks, I will testify for your claim. At the land office. Whatever they need from me." Harriet was at the cooking fire with her back to him. She did not turn around. She said, "I know." He said, "I mean it." She said, "I know you mean it." She paused. Then she said, "The soup will be ready in 20 minutes. They were in the cabin for 5 days. The storm broke on January 14th. They knew it before they opened the door in the way that people who have been listening to violent weather for 5 continuous days know when the quality of the sound changes, when the wind drops from sustained force to intermittent gusts and the percussion of driven snow against the walls goes quiet. Harriet had woken at 4 in the morning to a silence that was not the silence of the storm continuing, but the silence of it ending, and she had lain awake in the dark and felt a change in the air. By mid-morning, the sky had cleared to the flat blue of a Minnesota Territory day in January. The cold, still absolute minus 22 degrees, but still in a way it had not been still for 5 days. The drifts were enormous, reshaping the landscape into unfamiliar contours, burying fence posts and wood piles in the lower portions of anything that had stood in the path of the prevailing wind. Silas went outside first and stood in the transformed silence and looked at what 5 days had done. He looked north along the tree line toward where the rest of the district lay, the other farms and their conventional heating systems and their wood supplies and their chimneys. He already knew some of what he would find. The arithmetic of wood consumption during 5 days of minus 35-degree temperatures with sustained wind was not complicated. What he found over the following days as the district dug itself out and people moved between farms on snow-packed roads was worse than the arithmetic had suggested. 2 people had died. An elderly couple who lived alone 4 miles east, whose wood supply had run out on the 4th day of the storm. They had been found in their own bed on the morning of the 15th, together dressed in everything they owned in a house that had reached 28 degrees interior temperature. Their stove had been cold for at least 12 hours. 3 other families had burned through accessible wood and furniture and had survived only by burning floorboards from non-essential rooms. One family had lost all their livestock, 31 animals, when the barn heating system failed. Silas's own cattle had suffered significantly. He had lost 14 animals in the 5 days he was away from his farm animals. He had left with adequate hay, but inadequate temperature protection. He stood in his barn on the morning of January 15th and looked at what winter had taken. 14 animals. The arithmetic was not complicated, and he had no interest in softening it. He thought about the composting wall in Harriet's cabin, not as a curiosity, as a system, one that had held at 53 degrees for 5 continuous days, while his barn dropped below survivable temperature and his house dropped to 40. The conventional solution had just failed at the worst possible time. He had paid full price to learn that. He walked back to the main house and sat at the desk and opened the top drawer out of habit. The drawer was empty. He had carried the note to Harriet in the storm. It was sitting on her shelf beside her father's field journal now. He sat at the desk without anything in his hands. Prudence came into the room. She looked at him and said, "What are you thinking?" He said, "I am thinking about what we are going to do differently next winter." She sat down across from him. She said, "I think you should go talk to Harriet Voss." He said, "She may not want my input on her own system." Prudence said, "I did not say ask for her input. I said go talk to her. There is a difference." He rode to the property the following morning. The road was packed hard enough by the cold to support the horse, and he made the mile in reasonable time, the air clear and painfully cold, and absolutely still after 5 days of violence. Harriet was outside at the composting chamber access door, adding the scheduled fresh material. She had not missed a maintenance cycle during the 5 days of the storm, working through the access door that faced south and was partially sheltered by the cabin corner, adding material in the brief window each day when she judged conditions manageable. The chamber had been maintained on schedule throughout the storm. Silas dismounted and tied his horse. He watched her work for a moment. She was moving with the efficiency of someone performing a familiar task, forking layers of fresh horse manure and straw into the upper portion of the chamber, moistening each layer from the bucket at her feet. He said, "How much did the temperature drop during the storm inside?" She said the lowest reading was 51 degrees on the third morning. It recovered to 53 by midday. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to build one on the north wall of the main barn, not for the house, for the animals first. If the animals survive the worst of it, we can think about the house later." Harriet continued working. She said it will take 3 weeks to build the chamber correctly. Stonework cannot be rushed. The material loading takes another 3 weeks after that before the temperatures stabilize. He said, "I have time between now and next November." She said, "You have time." She paused. She said, "The stone selection is the most important part of the construction. I can show you what to look for." He said, "I was hoping you would say that." She straightened up and looked at him. She said, "What you brought me in the storm. The note. I want you to know that I understood what it cost you to bring it." He started to say something. She said, "I am not interested in the apology. I am interested in the testimony. March is 2 months away." He said, "I will be there." She said, "Then we understand each other." She went back to forking material into the chamber. She said, "Come back Thursday. I will have the stone specifications written out." He rode home through the clear, cold, still air of January in Minnesota territory, and he did not feel triumphant about any of it, which was the correct way to feel. He felt the particular quality of a man who has done something right after doing something wrong for a while, which is not the same as feeling good but is better than the alternative. The March hearing at the county land office took 4 hours. Constance Voss had prepared carefully. Her lawyer was thorough and had found 2 precedents in territorial case law where squatters' claims on drainage-impaired land had been vacated. The survey notes describing Harriet's parcel as poorly drained with evidence of subsurface water were entered as evidence. The argument was legally coherent and competently presented. Silas Greer testified for 40 minutes. He testified to his direct observation of the property in November and December of 1867. He testified to the interior temperature he had observed on 2 separate visits, measured on the thermometer he had seen with his own eyes. He testified to the 5 days his family had sheltered in the cabin during the January storm. The temperatures maintained the condition of everyone present when they arrived and when they left. He testified that the subsurface water that Constance's lawyer characterized as a drainage impediment was in fact an integral component of the heating system that Harriet Voss had designed and built and operated successfully through the worst winter in recent memory. He said the survey notes called the water a defect. Mrs. Voss made it a feature. That is not evidence of unsuitability for habitation. That is evidence of exceptional engineering. The land office examiner asked Silas one question after the testimony. He asked, "In your assessment, is the structure on this parcel suitable for human habitation through a Minnesota winter?" Silas said, "I sheltered there for 5 days in conditions that killed 2 of my neighbors in their own homes." I believe the assessment answers itself. The claim was upheld. The challenge was dismissed. Harriet sat in the back of the room and heard the decision and wrote the date in her father's field journal and nothing else beside it. Constance Voss left the county seat before the hearing had formally closed. She was not a woman given to visible defeat. She had worked within the rules as she understood them. She had found the argument she believed was strongest, and the argument had not prevailed. She would need to recalibrate. She was always recalibrating. It was what she did. What Constance did not fully understand, sitting in the wagon on the road back to the Voss farm, was that the legal outcome was not the most significant thing that had happened in that room. The most significant thing was that Silas Greer, the most successful farmer in the district, a man whose opinion shaped how other men in the community assessed value and risk and credibility, had stood up in a formal proceeding and described Harriet Voss's work as exceptional engineering. That assessment traveled. The way assessments travel in small communities where everyone knows what everyone else thinks and changes in that calculus matter. By April, it was understood throughout the district that the widow Voss had built a heating system that had outperformed every conventional stove in the territory during the worst storm in memory, and that Silas Greer had said so in front of the land examiner, and that the claim had been upheld, and that she was still there on that piece of land. Nobody had wanted teaching the system to anyone who asked. And people asked. Spring came to Minnesota territory with its usual combination of relief and mud, the snow releasing its hold on the landscape gradually and reluctantly, the fields emerging brown and sodden and full of potential. Harriet turned her small emergency garden into a proper kitchen garden, working the ground that had thawed above the spring's influence into something she could actually plant. She ordered seed from the settlement store with money she had saved over the winter from zero heating costs. She received the first visitor in late March, a farmer named Corbett Aldridge, 48 years old, whose north pasture barn was under-insulated and whose cattle losses in January had convinced him that something needed to change. He came to the property with his hat in his hands and a set of questions he had written down because he did not want to forget any of them. She spent 3 hours with him. She showed him the chamber, explained the stone wall construction, walked him through the material ratios in the layering methodology, in the ventilation design, in the moisture management principles. She showed him the field journal entries from October through January, the temperature records, the maintenance logs, the systematic observation of what worked and what required adjustment. She showed him the October entry about the floor drainage crisis and the corrections she had made, because a man building his own system needed to know about failure modes as much as he needed to know about normal operation. He took notes in the margins of his hat brim, which was the only paper he had brought. She gave him a written summary on 2 sheets of paper that she had prepared in February, anticipating that this conversation would happen eventually. She had written it carefully in the precise style of her father's field journal, with specific measurements and proportions and construction details that could be followed by someone who had never seen the system operating. He tried to pay her. She declined. He asked why. She said because knowledge is not diminished by being shared. She paused. Then she said also because I will want references when other people ask. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard someone laugh on her property, and it was not an unpleasant sound. Vera Stanton was among the second group to ask. She had spent 5 days pressed against Harriet's stone wall with nothing to do but understand exactly what she was feeling against her palm, and she had understood it thoroughly. She came to the property in early April with specific questions about moisture management and ventilation ratios, questions precise enough to tell Harriet that Vera had been thinking carefully about the system since January. They spent an afternoon together at the chamber access door, with Harriet explaining the floor drainage correction in particular detail, and Vera asking follow-up questions that were better than most of the questions Harriet had been asked so far. Before she left, Vera said the night I came through the door during the storm. The warmth. I have been thinking about it every day since. Harriet said, what have you been thinking? Vera said that I have been cold every winter for 11 years, and I did not know it was possible to not be cold. 6 families came to Harriet through the spring and early summer. She consulted on each project individually, visiting the sites, assessing the specific conditions, advising on the stone selection and the chamber positioning and the material sourcing. Each situation was different in its particulars. A barn required different chamber dimensions than a residence. A site with good subsurface drainage required different moisture management than a site like hers with constant spring access. She adapted the principles to each context and made notes on the adaptations and added them to the written documentation she was building. Silas began construction on the barn chamber in May. He came to Harriet twice a week through the spring with questions, and the questions were good ones. The questions of a man who was paying attention. She found that she did not mind answering them. He was a practical man when he was not being a proud one, and pride had been rearranged by January into something more manageable. He brought the stone himself from the creek bed she had shown him loaded and hauled it in the same methodical way she had hauled her own stone, not doing it to prove something, just doing what the work required. By October of 1868, she had a manuscript of 40 pages covering every aspect of biological heating system, design, and operation that she had developed through a year of direct practice, including the floor drainage failure and correction that had not been part of the original design. She sent a copy to the Agricultural Extension Office in St. Paul with a letter describing the results from the previous winter. The extension office sent a polite acknowledgement and nothing else for 3 months. Then they sent a request to publish an excerpt in the Quarterly Farming Journal. She wrote back saying they could publish the entire manuscript. The following winter, 1868 to 1869, 12 structures in the district had operating composting heating systems. 9 barns, 2 residences, 1 community meeting house. The results across all 12 were consistent with what the theory predicted. Baseline interior temperatures 50 to 65 degrees warmer than exterior in sustained cold conditions. Zero fuel costs for the heating function, reliable operation through the worst of the winter. Cold without the kind of emergency management that wood-fired systems required when supply ran short or conditions prevented resupply. The 2 elderly people who had died in January of 1868 were not replaced in the community's loss columns the following winter. Every farm that had adopted a system came through the cold season with its people and the majority of its animals intact. Silas Greer's barn with the composting chamber Harriet had designed for it maintained 45 degrees through the coldest nights of that second winter and lost no animals to cold. Harriet noted all of this in the field journal without additional comment. She was 64 years old and had been on her own land for 18 months. She had built a system that people had called madness and that had outlasted the worst winter anyone in the district could remember. She had defended her claim to the land in a legal proceeding and won. She had taught 6 families the principles of the work and watched 12 structures put those principles into operation, and she had done all of this without making it mean more than what it was. What it was work, important work, useful work, work that had come from a girl in Ohio watching her father probe an iron rod into a steaming manure pile on a cold morning and write down what he observed, and from a woman at 62 who had nothing left except the things she knew and the precision with which she applied them. She sat on the log at the edge of the North Marsh on an evening in October of 1868, the same place she had sat 14 months earlier with $40 and a set of calculations in a father's field journal and an idea that no one else had thought was worth having. The marsh grass was golden in the late light. The birch trees along the northern boundary had gone yellow and were dropping their leaves in the still air, each one falling in its own small arc, the accumulated letting go of a season finishing its work. The spring ran under the ground beneath her, doing what it had always done, constant and cold, and entirely indifferent to the purposes she had found for it. The same water that the land agent's survey notes had identified as the reason this particular parcel was worthless. The same water that had nearly ended the system in October of the previous year when she had not fully accounted for its lateral movement. The same water that had been keeping the bacteria working through the coldest nights of January while the storm raged and 6 people sat in a 12-by-8 room and were warm. She opened the field journal to the last written page. Below the March hearing date she had entered without comment, she wrote, "First winter complete. System performed within predicted parameters throughout following October correction to floor drainage. 2 lives lost in district, none in structures using the system. 12 systems operational for second winter. Documentation submitted for publication. Barn design added to manuscript." She paused. Then she wrote the land the survey called worthless was worthless for the wrong reasons. The drainage that was a defect for farming was a feature for what I needed. I could not have built the system anywhere else as well as I built it here. She paused again. Then she wrote, "Father was right about the bacteria." She closed the journal. The air was cooling toward the night temperature, which would be the first frost of the new season, and inside the cabin, the stone wall was beginning its long, steady work again. The thermophilic bacteria deep in the mass already running their ancient chemistry, indifferent to the season and the year, and the opinions of the people 1 mile south who had burned furniture in a January storm and walked through a blizzard to knock on a door that opened onto warmth. Heat moving through stone the way it had moved since October of the previous year. Reliable and continuous and demanding nothing except organic material and water and air. The same 3 things that most living things required. She picked up the journal and walked back to the cabin across the marsh grass in the cooling October evening, and the door closed behind her and the wall was warm.